June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. The air is thick with smoke and sand, the roar of naval guns still echoing across the waves. A Sherman tank named Fury lurches forward through the chaos before taking a direct hit from an 88mm shell. The crew scrambles out, some limping, others bleeding, leaving the smoldering hulk behind. The mission, it seems, is over. Except for one man. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a wiry New Jersey mechanic with oil-stained hands and a stubborn streak that bordered on madness, refuses to walk away. While others retreat for cover, Cullen stays with the crippled tank, eyes locked on the twisted metal like a surgeon staring at a patient no one believes can live. He has no engineering degree, no blueprint, and no approval. What he has is a blowtorch, a pile of scrap iron, and an idea that sounds insane even to him. Cullen's commanding officer calls him crazy. "You can't weld your way through France, Sergeant," the man shouts over the gunfire, but Cullen's mind is already racing. He's seen what's stopping the tanks, not German panzers, not mines, but the endless hedgerows of Normandy. Thick earthen walls, centuries old, high enough to hide a Tiger tank and strong enough to stop a Sherman dead. He looks at Fury's ruined front, then at the jagged steel from wrecked landing craft scattered on the beach. A plan begins to form, a modification so crude, so simple that it shouldn't work. Yet something deep inside tells him it just might. What he builds in the next 48 hours will become one of the most unexpected mechanical breakthroughs of the war, an invention so ingenious that Eisenhower himself will later order 5,000 of them. And it all starts with one mad mechanic, one broken tank, and one impossible idea. The days after D-Day were supposed to be a surge inland, fast, unstoppable, overwhelming. But instead, the Allied advance was crawling, trapped within a maze of ancient farmland. Normandy's hedgerows, earthen embankments topped with centuries-old brush, turned every field into a fortress. From above, the countryside looked like a checkerboard of green walls. From the ground, it was a nightmare. Shermans, built for open battle, rolled into one field only to be ambushed the moment they tried to climb out. Their treads would spin helplessly, lifting their noses high, exposing their weak underbellies. German anti-tank crews waited patiently on the other side, hidden in the brush. One shell and another Sherman became smoke and twisted steel. Cullen saw it happen again and again. His unit, the 2nd Armored Division, had lost half a dozen tanks in less than a day. Not from enemy armor, but from the land itself. The fields of Normandy had become killing traps. Command was desperate. Engineers proposed explosives, bulldozers, even dynamite-laced front plows. But nothing worked fast enough to keep the advance moving. And then there was Cullen, alone beside his crippled Sherman, covered in grease and grime, staring at the hedgerow like it was a riddle meant only for him to solve. He kicked at the dirt wall, watching how the roots twisted together like old muscle. "You can't go over it," he muttered, "but maybe you can cut through it." He crouched, ran his hand along the sharp edges of a landing craft plate nearby. Then, with the spark of his welding torch, the idea took form. He dragged the steel toward Fury, his boots sinking into mud as artillery thudded miles away. The sound of distant fighting mixed with the hiss of the torch as he welded, sparks flashing against the fading dusk. To passing soldiers, he looked insane. A lone mechanic trying to rebuild a wreck in the middle of a battlefield. They laughed. "Hey Cullen, you making a coffee machine or a coffin?" He didn't answer. The welding mask stayed down. The arc light danced. By midnight, shapes began to appear on Fury's hull. Jagged steel teeth welded beneath the front plate. Crude, uneven, ugly, but they looked hungry. Cullen's concept was simple. Metal prongs that would dig into the hedgerow, slice the roots, and let the tank push through rather than climb. When his commanding officer found out, he exploded. "You're defacing government property, Sergeant." Cullen just kept welding. "Sir, this thing's not art," he said through the smoke. "It's survival." Dawn came with gray light and thunder. German shells started falling again. The air smelled of oil and wet earth. Cullen's team, a few men crazy enough to believe him, climbed aboard Fury. The engine coughed to life, the steel beast rumbling like something half dead but angry to still be breathing. Ahead lay a hedgerow, thick, immovable, mocking. Cullen gripped the periscope, took a breath, and shouted, "Forward!" The Sherman lurched ahead. Its steel teeth met the wall, and instead of stopping, the hedgerow exploded outward in a spray of dirt and roots. Fury punched through like a charging bull, bursting into the next field in seconds. Silence followed. Then laughter, wild and disbelieving. The impossible had just happened. For the first time since landing in France, a Sherman tank had broken through the walls of Normandy. And the mad mechanic behind it? He just smiled beneath his helmet. Sparks still burned into his gloves. Because for Curtis Cullen, this wasn't madness anymore. It was proof. The morning air hung heavy with gunpowder and smoke as Cullen and his crew stared through Fury's periscope at the shattered hedgerow they'd just torn open. The cratered soil still steamed from the violence of their breakthrough. Beyond it lay open field, something none of them had seen since D-Day. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic purr of Fury's engine, steady and alive again. "Holy hell," muttered Corporal Davis, his voice trembling between disbelief and awe. You actually did it." Cullen didn't smile. He just stared at the gap in the wall, calculating. "One field isn't a victory," he said quietly. "Let's see if she can do it again." They turned the Sherman around and drove back through the hole, reversing into the previous field. Cullen's modification, those ugly steel prongs now caked in earth, held firm. The tank moved as if reborn, its new front end tearing through the landscape like it had always belonged that way. But as Fury roared into its second pass, the gunfire began. German MG-42s opened up from the hedges ahead, tracers slicing through the air. "Contact left!" Davis shouted, swinging the turret. The coaxial machine gun rattled back in reply. The tank's new teeth slammed into another hedgerow. This time, there was no hesitation. The roots ripped apart under the weight, the earthen wall collapsing forward in chunks. Fury surged through the debris, bursting out into the next field, straight into the line of fire. "Back up! Back up!" the gunner yelled. But Cullen kept pushing. The modified tank wasn't just surviving, it was charging. The Germans hadn't expected a Sherman to break the barrier. Their flank was exposed, their cover gone. In seconds, they were retreating, scrambling for safety. When the shooting stopped, Fury sat smoking at the center of a ruined hedgerow, its steel prongs bent and glowing red from friction. Cullen climbed out, still clutching his welding gloves. The smell of burning grass and hot metal filled the air. His crew followed, stunned. "You realize what we just did?" Davis said. "We've been stuck in these damn squares for a week. You just drew a door through them." Cullen knelt beside the mangled prongs, inspecting them like a craftsman admiring his handiwork. "Not a door," he said softly. "A key," word spread fast. By the next morning, officers from nearby units had arrived to see the so-called Cullen cutter for themselves. They circled Fury like museum visitors, inspecting every weld, every scorch mark. Some were skeptical, others awestruck. "You're telling me this thing made it through 3 hedgerows?" one lieutenant asked. 4, Cullen corrected, not looking up. "And she's got another dozen in her." Within hours, field engineers were taking measurements, sketching the design in notebooks, tracing the weld seams with chalk. Cullen barely noticed them. He was already thinking about improvements, stronger plates, cleaner angles, better penetration through the thickest root lines. The colonel in charge of the 2nd Armored Division called it unorthodox. Cullen just shrugged. So was invading Europe. That night, Fury rested near the edge of a French village. Cullen sat on her hull, watching flares drift across the sky. The beaches had been conquered, but France itself remained a labyrinth. Tanks were still dying by the dozens, trapped in those green walls. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Fury wouldn't be the only one with teeth. As the sound of distant artillery rolled through the valley, Cullen whispered to himself, "They'll call me mad for this, but let's see how crazy they sound when they're the ones moving forward." Somewhere in the darkness, a new kind of warfare was being born, not from blueprints or command orders, but from the sparks of one man's torch and his refusal to accept the word impossible. By dawn, word of Sergeant Curtis Cullen's strange invention had spread faster than gunfire. Across the muddy fields of Normandy, tank commanders were whispering about a Sherman that could eat hedgerows. Mechanics who'd been fighting with busted gearboxes and jammed treads now wanted one thing, whatever Cullen had welded to his tank. At first, higher command didn't believe it. The report sounded absurd. A field modification built from scrap metal? A handful of welders changing the course of the invasion? It read more like a rumor than a briefing. But then photographs arrived. Grainy black and white images of Fury bursting through hedgerows like paper. And right behind it, infantrymen moving freely through gaps that once took days to clear. Suddenly, headquarters was listening. Cullen was summoned to demonstrate his creation for a group of engineers and officers. The field they chose looked no different from 100 others. Quiet, harmless, until you saw the thick, twisting wall of roots and earth ahead. Commanders stood with binoculars in hand, their expressions skeptical. Cullen, in his soot-stained uniform, climbed onto Fury and motioned to his driver. "Let's show him." The tank rumbled forward. The steel teeth at its nose glinted in the sunlight. There was a thunderous crack as the machine hit the hedgerow, then a shattering explosion of dirt. Fury emerged on the other side, trailing smoke and triumph. The officers lowered their binoculars in stunned silence. One engineer whispered, "It shouldn't be possible." "It isn't," said another. "But there it is." Cullen jumped down, wiping sweat and soot from his face. "You wanted a way through," he said. "Now you've got one." Within hours, the design was being copied in every Allied motor pool within range of a welding torch. Mechanics scoured beaches, scrap heaps, and wrecked landing craft for steel plating. Improvised workshops sprang up in the open, sparks flying through the night as soldiers transformed ordinary Shermans into hedgerow killers. Some of the welds were rough, some precise, but they all worked. In just 2 days, the Cullen cutter spread through the 2nd Armored Division like wildfire. By the end of the week, over 500 tanks had been fitted with the modification. By the end of the month, over $5,000. For Cullen, it was surreal. The same officers who once called him reckless were now sending him blueprints to standardize his design. Journalists began showing up, scribbling notes, calling him the Mad Mechanic of Normandy. Cullen hated the nickname, but he couldn't deny the pride. Still, amid the applause and praise, he saw something darker. Every breakthrough came with a cost. Many of his fellow mechanics had been killed scavenging metal under fire. Some tanks didn't survive their first charge through the hedges. Even Fury bore scars, bent prongs, burned paint, chipped armor. But every dent told a story. Every scar meant progress. That evening, Cullen walked alone through a shattered field, the sun bleeding into the horizon. The hedgerows, once walls of death, now lay broken and torn apart. In the distance, dozens of Shermans with jagged steel teeth stood ready, engines rumbling in unison like beasts waiting to be unleashed. He placed his hand on Fury's battered hull. "You did good, girl," he whispered. Then, as the engines roared to life and the armored columns began to roll, Curtis Cullen climbed back into his seat. The invasion that had stalled for weeks was finally moving again, because one stubborn mechanic refused to walk away from a broken tank. And as Fury led the charge through the next wall of green, Cullen realized the truth. The real war wasn't just fought with guns or bombs. It was fought with ideas. The morning of July 25, 1944, broke under a thunder that shook the earth itself. Allied bombers swept over the Normandy countryside in waves, hammering the German lines ahead of St. Lo. Dust and debris filled the sky. Beneath that storm, thousands of Shermans lined up across the hedgerow country, engines rumbling, men gripping their helmets, the steel teeth of Cullen's invention glinting through the smoke. It was the opening of Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. For nearly 2 months, the Allied armies had been trapped inside those infernal hedges, but not today. Not anymore. Sergeant Curtis Cullen stood beside Fury, her front plates blackened from battle, her prongs freshly sharpened and reinforced. His once crazy idea was now standard issue. Crews called the new design Rhino tanks. Cullen still preferred his original name, cutters. They didn't just ram through obstacles. They tore them apart. "All right, boys," he said to his crew, voice calm but sharp. "This is what we built her for. Let's give 'em something to remember." The order came. Advance. The Shermans roared forward as one. The ground shook with the weight of steel and fury. Ahead lay the last wall of Normandy, a dense, towering hedgerow, dug in with German MG nests and anti-tank guns. For weeks that wall had defied every assault. But this time, the tanks didn't stop. Cullen's fury hit the hedgerow first. The jagged prongs dug in deep, the sound of tearing roots and cracking timber echoing like gunfire. The massive wall of earth split open under the assault, the Sherman bursting through in an explosion of dirt. Within seconds, dozens followed, pouring through the gaps, each tank carving a new hole through what had once been impenetrable. German soldiers, expecting another stalled attack, froze. Machine gun fire erupted in panic. Anti-tank shells screamed past. Fury's gun barked back, sending a high-explosive shell into a farmhouse-turned-bunker. The explosion shook the ground. Allied infantry rushed through the newly formed breaches, using the tanks for cover as they poured into the open. In less than an hour, the unthinkable happened. The hedgerow line broke. Allied tanks were moving, fast, freely, and unstoppable. The nightmare terrain that had cost thousands of lives became a highway of victory. As Cullen's tank rumbled through the shattered fields, he could hardly believe it. He looked back through the periscope. Behind him, the horizon was alive with motion. Dust clouds, tanks, soldiers, trucks, all moving west, all finally free. A message came through the radio, half static, half disbelief. "Command confirms. Hedgerows breached across the entire sector. Repeat, the line is broken." Cullen leaned back in his seat, eyes heavy, hands trembling. For weeks he had dreamed of this moment, and now that it was real, it felt impossible. Mad, huh? He muttered with a grin. Guess crazy's contagious. Outside, a war correspondent snapped a photograph of Fury as it thundered past, its welded teeth caked with mud and glory. That image would appear in newspapers across the world, captioned simply, "The Sherman that ate Normandy." By nightfall, the Allies were racing across open country. German lines collapsed under the pressure. General Omar Bradley, watching the advance from his command post, turned to his staff and said, This changes everything." And somewhere in that chaos of victory, Curtis Cullen, grease on his hands, exhaustion in his bones, realized that his welding torch had done what entire divisions could not. His tank wasn't just a machine anymore. It was the spark that had turned the tide of a continent. The battle for Normandy was still raging when Sergeant Curtis Cullen was summoned to the command tent outside St. Lo. The air smelled of diesel, sweat, and gunpowder. Tanks rumbled in the distance, some carrying his welded cutters, others being retrofitted with them right there on the field. Cullen stood outside, still in his grease-stained uniform, helmet tucked under his arm. A guard waved him in. Inside, several high-ranking officers were gathered around a map table, among them, General Omar Bradley himself. Cullen froze. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was just a mechanic, a sergeant who welded things, not someone who shared air with generals. Bradley looked up from the map. "You're Cullen?" "Yes, sir," Cullen replied, his voice steady but uncertain. The general smiled faintly. "You're the one who came up with those teeth?" Cullen hesitated, then nodded. "Just seemed like the tank ought to cut the hedge instead of climb it, sir." Bradley exchanged glances with the officers around him, half disbelief, half admiration. "Do you realize what you've done, Sergeant? You've given us back momentum. We were bleeding men every day trying to break through those hedgerows. Now, because of your idea, our armor moves like it's supposed to." Cullen didn't know what to say. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had held a welding torch just weeks ago, praying his crazy fix wouldn't get him court-martialed. "Sir," he finally said, "I didn't do it alone. My men helped me. And those boys out there driving the tanks, they made it work." Bradley nodded. "A good soldier always says that. But make no mistake, this idea came from you. That kind of thinking wins wars." He stepped forward and extended his hand. "On behalf of the United States Army, well done." Cullen shook it, stunned. Around the room, officers clapped lightly, a rare honor for an enlisted man. Bradley turned to his aide. "Send a report to Eisenhower's headquarters. Let him know about this Cullen device, and make sure Ordnance starts mass-producing it immediately." Within days, thousands of Rhino kits were being bolted onto tanks across Europe. Welders worked day and night in depots from Normandy to Cherbourg. Photographs of the modified Shermans began circulating among Allied units, jagged blades gleaming beneath the turrets, cutting paths through fields and fences alike. And just like that, the once-forgotten sergeant from New Jersey became the face of one of the most ingenious field modifications in modern warfare. But Cullen didn't feel like a hero. Not really. When the reporters came asking for interviews, he dodged them. When officers offered to pin medals on him, he shrugged. To him, it wasn't about recognition, it was about survival. The tanks needed to move. The men needed a chance to live through the next assault. That's all he ever wanted. One evening, as the sun set behind the ruined hedgerows, Cullen sat on Fury's turret, cigarette between his lips, staring at the quiet fields that had once been killing grounds. Private Johnson, his driver, climbed up beside him. "So, Sarge, you realize the whole army's using your idea now?" Cullen exhaled smoke through a tired smile. "Yeah, crazy, isn't it?" Johnson nodded toward the horizon. "You think it'll end the war faster?" Cullen's eyes narrowed. "If it gets one more kid home alive, it's worth every weld." They sat there in silence, the smell of fuel and earth all around them. The once impossible had become ordinary. Not because of generals, not because of grand strategies, but because one man refused to give up on a broken tank. Somewhere far away, Eisenhower read the report and scrawled 3 words in the margin. Simple, brilliant, approved. Cullen never saw that note, but he didn't need to. The roar of tanks cutting through the hedgerows was all the recognition he'd ever wanted. July 1944. The sun burned low over the French countryside, casting long shadows over the hedgerows that had once trapped Allied forces like rats in a maze. But today the ground trembled, not with the hopeless grinding of stuck tanks, but with the steady, confident advance of a new kind of Sherman. They called them Rhino tanks. The lead vehicle, its steel teeth glinting with dirt and sunlight, roared forward. The sharp prongs welded to its front bit into the thick earthen wall, tearing through the ancient roots like paper. The hedgerow exploded in a shower of soil and leaves. Behind it, infantrymen cheered, running through the gap as the tank continued to plow forward, its engine howling like an animal unleashed. "Go! Go! Go!" shouted Lieutenant Fraser, waving his men through. The rhinos made a hole. "Move before Jerry gets his bearings!" Machine guns rattled from the trees ahead, but now the Allies had cover and mobility. Sherman after Sherman followed, each with its own set of Cullen's cutters. What had once been impassable terrain now crumbled beneath their advance. One German officer, peering through binoculars from a farmhouse attic, couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Das ist unmöglich," he muttered. His adjutant beside him stammered. "The hedgerows, they are cutting through them like they were never there," the officer finished, his voice low. Defeated. German defenses that had taken months to perfect hidden machine gun nests. Camouflaged anti-tank positions were suddenly useless. The Shermans didn't climb up the embankments anymore. They cut straight through, keeping their silhouettes low and their armor angled. The element of surprise was gone for the Germans, and the tide was turning one hedgerow at a time. At an operations tent miles behind the line, Colonel Robert P. Hoggett looked at the latest field reports. He couldn't stop shaking his head in disbelief. "They're advancing at twice the expected rate," he said to his aide. "Same terrain, same enemy. The only difference is those cutters." He looked up at a photograph pinned to the board. A Sherman with jagged metal blades welded beneath its nose, dust and smoke curling around it. Underneath, someone had scribbled the name, Cullen's Teeth. On the ground, Sergeant Cullen himself wasn't resting. He and his crew were right there in the thick of it, their own tank, Fury, leading one of the assaults. The modified teeth screeched as they hit another wall of vegetation. Inside the tank, the crew was sweating, the air thick with oil fumes. "Hold her steady," Cullen shouted over the roar. "I'm trying, Sarge! This thing's fighting back!" the driver yelled, gripping the controls. With one final shove, the Sherman burst through the hedge like a battering ram. The sudden opening revealed a startled German anti-tank crew, setting up a POC 40 gun just 100 yards away. "Target front," Cullen barked. The gunner didn't hesitate. The main cannon fired, the shell screaming across the field. The German gun vanished in a fireball. Cheers erupted inside the tank. "Ha! That's what you get for hiding in the bushes." The loader laughed, slapping the side of the turret. Cullen managed a grin but said nothing. He knew it wasn't luck. It was preparation. It was adaptation. It was what happened when men refused to accept impossible as an answer. Across Normandy, word of the mad mechanic spread. Field commanders credited Cullen's innovation for breaking through the German defensive line. Military reporters dubbed the devices Cullen's cutters, and within weeks, factories across England were replicating them by the thousands. Yet amidst all the noise and glory, Cullen remained focused. Each cut through a hedgerow wasn't just another victory. It was another soldier saved. Another step toward the liberation of France. As night fell, Cullen's Rhino tank rolled into a captured French village. The villagers cheered, offering wine and bread to the tired soldiers. Cullen looked around at the smiling faces, free again after years of occupation. He didn't say much, but inside, he felt it. A broken tank had become a symbol of unstoppable progress. And the man once called mad had proven that sometimes, madness is just another word for vision. By August 1944, the once quiet French countryside echoed with the sound of liberation. Engines growling, artillery thunder in the distance, and the rhythmic clatter of tank treads grinding toward Paris. What had started as a desperate battlefield fix by a single mad mechanic now rolled like a storm across Europe. Sergeant Curtis Cullen's invention, the Rhino cutter, was no longer a curiosity or a field experiment. It was now a standardized modification, welded to thousands of Allied Shermans from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belgium. Each one bore the same crude metal prongs forged from scrap steel and salvaged German obstacles, a brutal symbol of American ingenuity turned into momentum. Cullen himself watched it unfold from the turret of Fury. Still patched and scarred from those early fights, he wasn't used to attention. Yet wherever he went, soldiers wanted to shake his hand. Engineers wanted to hear the story, and generals wanted to see what kind of mind could have thought this up. One afternoon, a military convoy stopped near a hedgerow-lined road outside St. Lo. Cullen stood beside his tank as a jeep pulled up. Inside sat none other than General Omar Bradley. The general stepped out, inspecting the welded teeth at the front of Fury. He ran his gloved hand along the jagged metal, nodding slowly. So this is the famous Rhino, Bradley said, looking up at Cullen. You built this from scrap? Yes, sir, Cullen replied, trying to keep his tone respectful despite the disbelief in his own voice. Just welded some steel from the beach obstacles. Didn't seem right that the Germans' defenses were stopping us dead. Bradley smiled faintly. Well, Sergeant, you've done more for the advance than any tank factory in Detroit. You turned an idea into a weapon. Cullen blinked, unsure what to say. Bradley offered a rare smile before turning to his aide. Make sure this man's design is in every damn tank we send to the front. Within days, new Shermans were rolling off British docks fitted with factory-made cutters, smoother, standardized, but still unmistakably Cullen's. Reporters from Stars and Stripes called it the blade that opened France. Even the BBC ran a piece dubbing Cullen the mechanic who cut through Hitler's walls. But Cullen wasn't interested in fame. When interviewed, he simply said, "We just needed to move forward. That's all I wanted." Meanwhile, German field reports painted a very different picture. Wehrmacht officers wrote of American tanks emerging from the earth like beasts, their defenses collapsing under the speed and unpredictability of the Allied advance. The hedgerows that once offered perfect ambush positions had turned into traps for the Germans themselves. Every tank that pushed through a hedge carried not just men and ammunition, but Cullen's spirit, a quiet defiance that refused to accept limitations. In one fierce engagement outside the village of Morton, Cullen's modified tank led a column through a maze of bocage under constant fire. The Rhino blades ripped through the barriers, allowing the infantry to keep pace. German panzer grenadiers tried to flank, but the Shermans were already behind them, breaking their lines apart piece by piece. When the smoke cleared, an exhausted Cullen climbed out of fury. His face was smeared with oil, his eyes red from smoke, but there was a rare smile on his lips. Around him, Allied soldiers celebrated, not because they'd just won a battle, but because they'd proven that even nature's obstacles couldn't hold them anymore. That night, by the dim glow of lanterns, Cullen sat on the tank's hull, repairing a cracked weld with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. A young soldier passing by stopped and said, "Hey Sarge, rumors they're gonna give you a medal for all this." Cullen chuckled without looking up. "I don't need a medal, kid. I just need this damn tank to keep running." The next morning, fury rolled on again, cutting through the mist, through the mud, through history itself. Cullen's invention had done more than change the course of the campaign. It had redefined what a single soldier's idea could do. It wasn't just a machine part. It was a movement, welded from desperation, madness, and pure willpower. And as fury disappeared over the next ridge, the dawn light caught the Rhino blades, making them gleam like silver teeth in the rising sun, the mark of a mechanic who refused to give up. By late September 1944, the Allied war machine was surging across Europe like a relentless tide. Town after town fell, German defenses crumbled, and what had once been thought impossible, advancing beyond the hedgerows of Normandy, had become almost routine. Behind that momentum, tucked deep inside the reports and battlefield chatter, one name kept resurfacing: Sergeant Curtis Cullen. To most soldiers, he wasn't a mechanic anymore. He was a myth, the man who turned junk metal into a war-winning weapon. Tank crews swapped stories about him between battles, some true, some wildly exaggerated. They say he built the first Rhino using only a pocket knife and a cigarette lighter, one gunner joked. Others claimed he'd welded it under enemy fire while German snipers tried to take him out. The stories grew taller with each retelling, but the truth, as always, was even more remarkable. Cullen himself remained the same unassuming soldier, grease under his nails, sleeves rolled up, more comfortable under a tank than in front of a camera. But his creation had outgrown him. Factory-made Rhinos now rolled off production lines in England, fitted on every Sherman bound for the front. His idea had crossed oceans and battlefields, reshaping strategy itself. In an improvised field command post near the Belgian border, General Dwight D. Eisenhower received a report from his logistics staff. The Rhino conversion has increased armored advance speed by an estimated 65% through bocage and similar terrain. Eisenhower looked up, tapping the paper with his finger. "One man did this?" he asked quietly. "Just a sergeant, sir," replied his aide. A welder from New Jersey, Eisenhower nodded, half smiling. Sometimes the right idea doesn't come from the top. Meanwhile, in the small towns liberated by Rhino-equipped Shermans, French villagers came out to watch the American tanks thunder by. Kids waved, farmers cheered, and the tanks, scarred, muddy but unstoppable, became symbols of freedom itself. Each one carried those distinctive metal teeth, the hedgerow cutters, jutting from the front like the jaws of an iron beast. Soldiers started calling them Cullen's fangs. Even German prisoners interviewed after capture admitted their shock. One officer told interrogators, "We built our defenses assuming your tanks would be trapped, but they came through the walls as if they were paper. We couldn't believe it." In the days that followed, Cullen's Rhino did more than move tanks. It moved morale. It proved that improvisation could win battles, that ingenuity could outthink even the most fortified enemy plans. In a war dominated by mass production and giant machines, it reminded everyone that victory still depended on human creativity. But while Cullen's idea spread like wildfire, he stayed in the background, uncomfortable with praise. When a journalist from Stars and Stripes tracked him down for an interview, he shrugged off the fame. "We were stuck," he said simply, "so I figured we'd better cut our way out." That's all there is to it. Still, among his men, the respect was real and deep. They called him the Mad Mechanic, not as an insult, but as a badge of honor. They'd seen him risk his life patching tanks under fire, welding armor at midnight, covered in sparks and sweat, muttering to himself like a man possessed. In one photo that would later become iconic, Cullen stood beside Fury, his arms folded, welding mask hanging from his neck, the rhino blades glinting behind him. He looked neither like a hero nor a commander, just a tired mechanic who'd somehow helped change the course of the war. As autumn settled over the French countryside, Cullen's unit prepared to push into the Siegfried Line, the Germans' final fortress. The ground was wet, the air cold, and yet the men were confident. They had their tanks, their blades, and their belief in the man who had taught them that even a broken machine could be reborn stronger. Somewhere in the distance, a tank engine roared to life. Cullen looked toward the sound, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let's see if the Rhino can chew through Germany too," he said. And with that, the Mad Mechanic climbed back into Fury, his invention leading the way once again, toward the final battles, toward history, and toward the legend that would bear his name forever. April 1945. The war in Europe was nearly over. German resistance was collapsing, and Allied tanks rolled through ruined cities where white flags fluttered from shattered windows. In one of those columns rumbled Fury, its rhino blades still bolted to the front, battered, burned, but unbroken. Sergeant Curtis Cullen sat on the turret, staring across the Rhine as the smoke of the final battles drifted away. Around him, men cheered, waved, and celebrated the end of years of blood and exhaustion. But Cullen didn't feel like a hero. He just looked down at the welded metal teeth that had changed everything. From scrap on a beach to a tool that cut through Hitler's strongest defenses, it all still felt unreal. Eisenhower's order to produce 5,000 rhinos had been more than a commendation. It had been a declaration of what one mind could do when rules, doubt, and fear were stripped away. When Cullen finally returned home, there were no parades waiting, no medals on his chest. But every tank crewman who'd survived the hedgerows owed their lives to the sparks from his blowtorch and the madness of his belief that nothing was impossible. Years later, historians would call it one of the simplest and most effective battlefield innovations of World War II. A handful of welded steel bars, nothing more, had opened the path to victory. In the quiet after the war, Cullen's words to a fellow mechanic would sum up his legacy best. "It wasn't genius," he said. "It was just refusing to stop. And that, more than the tanks, the generals, or the battles, is how one mad mechanic and a broken Sherman tank helped change the fate of a world."